Okay, well, thank you for having me here this evening. I'm going to try to do two things in my comments this evening. First of all, I'd like to go over what exactly happened in Gaza this past July and August, to sort through the factual record and to separate out the fact from the fiction about what unfolded during those 51 days. And secondly, I think many audiences are becoming or growing more impatient about not hearing practical things that can be done and hearing too many analyses. So what I want to do in the second half of my remarks is, as the expression has it, to get down to brass tacks and to go through the various strategies that Palestinians have attempted over the past couple of decades, and to figure out what works, what doesn't, and what needs to be done in order to finally achieve a just and lasting peace. The prospects now, I would say, are quite dim. Things are spiraling downward in Israel-Palestine, in the occupied Palestinian territories. And there was another setback today on the legal front when the International Criminal Court, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, refused to adjudicate the killings of 9 civilians on the humanitarian flotilla led by the Mavi Marmara, though they being killed by Israeli commandos. And the International Criminal Court, in the statement they received, said there's good evidence that these are war crimes, but they are not of significant enough gravity that they should be adjudicated, which is exactly what you would expect from the International Criminal Court, given that its record thus far is that only Africans have been prosecuted by it, ergo only Africans are capable of committing significant war crimes. And so Israel, but not just Israel, the West in general, gets a free pass before that farcical institution. So let's see what happened. I'll try to go through the record as best as I understand it, but I will concede from the get-go that unlike in previous Israeli assaults on Gaza in 2008-9, Operation Cast Lead, 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense, this most recent operation, Protective Edge, there are still areas of let's call it nebulousness, cloudiness about what happened. The starting point, I think, is April 2014, when the Palestinian Islamic group Hamas joined what was called a reconciliation government with the Palestinian Authority. Surprisingly, after Hamas joined with the Palestinian Authority in forming this national reconciliation government, surprisingly, the US and the EU did not break relations with the new government, notwithstanding the fact that Hamas was a member of it. They took what you might call a wait-and-see approach. Let's see what comes of it. That was the first surprising development. The second surprising development was the new government, which was technically still led by Mahmoud Abbas. The new government announced, in the name of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, the new government announced that it was still going to abide by the 3 conditions set by the West for negotiations. Those 3 conditions were, number 1, renunciation of violence, number 2, recognition of Israel, and number 3, recognition of past agreements that had been signed, most notably the Oslo Accord and what was later the second major agreement, the roadmap. Well, here was the US and the EU negotiating with a government that included, according to Prime Minister Netanyahu, a terrorist organization. And he erupted in a rage. This was not the first, but the second time he was being slighted by the US and the EU. The first, of course, was when the US and EU entered into negotiations with Iran, notwithstanding the fact that Mr. Netanyahu said that Iran was, among other things, threatening Israel with a second Holocaust. So after this slight, now it was adding salt to the wound. The US and the EU were still open to negotiations with the new government. He was enraged and made his rage very plain, but he didn't have many options about what he could actually do to thwart these new negotiations until a gift dropped into his lap. And the gift that dropped into his lap was the abduction of the 3 Israeli teenagers. That still remains a slightly murky episode, but about 2 things I think there is reasonable clarity. Point number 1, all sides agree that Hamas's leadership had nothing to do with the abductions. It is true that a Hamas cell has been implicated, but the leadership itself was not aware of what happened. That's the official position both of Hamas and the Israeli government. The second thing that's not, I think, seriously in question is that almost immediately after the 3 Israeli youths were abducted, they were almost immediately killed. However, Mr. Netanyahu, being a politician, and politicians being, among other things, people capable of exploiting opportunities as they come along, he realized this was a big opportunity, an opportunity to thwart the negotiations. And so he launched what was called Operation Brother's Keeper, went on a rampage in the West Bank, killed about a half-dozen Palestinians, detonated a couple of Palestinian homes, ransacked businesses, ransacked homes, arrested around 700 Palestinians, among them about the overwhelming majority being members of Hamas. And the purpose was perfectly obvious. The purpose was to try to provoke a violent reaction from Hamas so that they would, so to speak, prove or manifest the fact that they are a terrorist organization, just as Mr. Netanyahu had been maintaining. Or, as he put it later in a conversation with the US State Department, he said, "Never second guess me again. When I say they're terrorists, they're terrorists." As it happened initially, Hamas resisted the provocations, but other armed groups in Gaza did not. And quickly things spiraled out of control. And before you know it, there was a new operation in the making, this one christened Operation Protective Edge. The operation had some interesting features. The first one was that Israel always has, or has had, I should say, since 2006 when it tangled with Hezbollah, the party of God in Lebanon. Israel has always been forced into a dilemma that was exacerbated during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9. And the dilemma goes something like this. A conflict erupts, and then these projectiles start flying from Gaza. The projectiles cannot be disabled by the air. They can only be disabled in a ground invasion. But a ground invasion poses its own problems. If you go into a ground invasion, there's the potential for significant combatant casualties. And Israeli society, it's a Sparta-like society, and it doesn't tolerate significant combatant casualties. It actually tolerates more significant civilian casualties than combatant casualties. That's counterintuitive, but it's a different ethic at work in that society. So if you launch a ground invasion, it means significant potentially significant combatant casualties. Well, how do you avoid the significant combatant casualties? That's kind of a no-brainer. It's what Israel did in 2008-9 during Operation Cast Lead. The orders were very explicit. The Israelis were unusually candid during that massacre. The orders were, as you enter Gaza, you blast everything in sight. You blast everything to the left of you, everything to the right of you, and everything in front of you. And if you blast everything in sight, you level everything in sight, then the possibility or the potential for significant combatant casualties is drastically reduced. And in fact, during Operation Cast Lead, it was a pretty much, you can call it, cost-free massacre. 10 Israeli combatants were killed, and of those 10, half of them, or 4 of the 10, were killed by friendly fire. The problem for Israel was this. After 2008-9 Operation Cast Lead, there was a huge international reaction, very hostile to Israel. It climaxed in what came to be called the Goldstone Report, which indicted Israel for very significant war crimes and crimes against humanity. And so now a red line had been drawn by the international community. You can't carry on again as you did in 2008-9. So that was the dilemma that Israel faced. If it goes in and it blasts everything in sight, it's going to bring down the wrath of the international community. If it goes in and doesn't blast everything in sight, there's the potential for significant combatant casualties, which is going to bring down the wrath of domestic Israeli society. And so during the first 2 weeks of this latest operation, Netanyahu held back, held back, held back. People kept asking, when is the ground invasion going to begin? When is the ground invasion going to begin? But he held back, not for any humanitarian reasons, but there was a real political dilemma there. He held back until 2 new gifts dropped into his lap. The first gift was this rigged ceasefire proposal that seems to have been concocted by Tony Blair, but formally presented by the strongman in Egypt, Sisi, the so-called president of Egypt. And it was, as I said, a rigged ceasefire proposal for a very simple reason. As I suspect virtually every person in this room knows, Gaza has been enduring for the past 7 and more years an illegal and inhuman blockade. And Hamas has always said, in each of the conflicts with Israel, has consistently said as the major goal to lift the blockade. And immediately as the conflict erupted now for the 3rd time in 5 years, immediately as it erupted, Hamas predictably again called for the lifting of the blockade. Well, the ceasefire proposal had as one of its planks, one of its elements, it had the proviso that the blockade would be lifted, but only after the security situation on the ground stabilized. Well, what does that mean? If, according to Israel, Hamas is a terrorist organization, then the security situation on the ground would only stabilize when either Hamas was defeated or Hamas was disarmed. And so it was clear from the get-go that Hamas would have to reject those terms for ending the round of fighting. So, as was predicted, incidentally, for those of you who are interested in technical points, 2 other ceasefires were signed between Israel and Hamas, one in June 2008 and another in November 2012. Neither of those ceasefires contained that proviso, that caveat, that the security situation on the ground had to stabilize. And in fact, even after the last round, when it ended at the end of August of this past year, it didn't include that proviso. That was designed to evoke from or elicit from Hamas a negative response, which is exactly what Hamas did. It rejected that ceasefire proposal. But now Mr. Netanyahu had his pretext, namely, we accepted the ceasefire proposal, they rejected it, and they are firing all these projectiles at us. What choice do we have? We have to go in and launch that ground invasion. The second gift that dropped in his lap, one of a more immediate sort, was the downing of the Malaysian airliner. Politics, as I said, is often just about exploiting the opportunity of the moment. When the Malaysian airliner was downed, all the cameras shifted from Gaza and were now riveted on the Malaysian airliner. And Netanyahu recognized here was a moment for him. And as I said, he's a good politician, I suppose. And in 1989, most of you in this room are much, much, much too young to remember, but during the first Intifada, which one of the persons who introduced me, she alluded to, in 1989, during the first Intifada, it was a mass nonviolent resistance to the Israeli occupation. In the midst of it, the Tiananmen massacre occurred in China. So some of you are wondering, well, what does that have to do with the price of pizza in Brazil? In fact, they have a lot to do with each other. At the time, Netanyahu said in a famous speech at Bar-Ilan University, he said, Israel should have taken advantage of the Tiananmen massacre when all the cameras shifted to China. He should have taken advantage of that moment to carry out an expulsion in the West Bank during the first Intifada. And he criticized Israel for not taking advantage. Well, now he had his, so to speak, Tiananmen moment, that being the downing of the Malaysian airliner, and literally on the night of the day when the Malaysian airliner was downed, that was the moment he chose to launch the ground invasion. The ground invasion escalated the terror attacks by Israel, as Amnesty International pointed out in a report it issued 2 days ago, saying that Israel was guilty of what's called serious violations of international humanitarian law, which means war crimes. They pointed out that already on July 8th, that's before the ground invasion, already on July 8th, Israel was already targeting civilian dwellings, civilian apartment houses, committing massacres on a fairly impressive scale in Gaza. And those precision terrorist attacks They were escalated after the ground invasion began. Israel, in addition to targeting homes, began to target businesses, schools, mosques, hospitals, ambulances, power stations, sewage plants, civilian shelters, and citizens who were fleeing from the bombing. Typically, Israel uses the argument that if there were massive civilian casualties, as there were in this case, they claim it's because Hamas is using Palestinians as human shields. They made the same sort of claim during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9. And then, as now, there is no evidence to support that claim. We still don't have the full record of what Israel did in Gaza because the human rights organizations haven't yet produced all their reports. But we have some sampling of what human rights organizations observed during the attack, as well as journalists like from the BBC, and all of them said that there's no evidence that Hamas was engaging in human shielding. I should also point out in passing that it's going to be very difficult this time to get the human rights reports because Israel barred organizations like Amnesty International from entering Gaza. And when the last report was issued, the one I mentioned a few moments ago, Israel said it was a Hamas document. The purpose was perfectly obvious, namely, you engage in targeting civilians and civilian objects. You're hoping you're going to break the will of the people to resist or turn them against Hamas at some point. By the end, the estimates are 2,200 Palestinians were killed. Of those 2,200, about 70 to 75%, 1,500 were civilians. Over 500 children were killed. 10,000 were injured. Minimally, the infrastructure damage is estimated now at $6 billion. The head of the International Commission of the Red Cross, he said, "I've never seen such massive destruction ever before." The Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, he said, "The massive deaths and destruction in Gaza have shocked and shamed the world." And then probably, I think, the most authoritative statement came from Sarah Roy at Harvard University. Sarah Roy, she's as we used to say, she's a good egg, very decent person, very smart person. She's also the daughter of a survivor of Auschwitz concentration camp, and she's devoted the whole of her adult professional life to studying Gaza. She wrote the authoritative study of the Gaza economy. She then wrote another study, it was published about 3 years ago from Princeton University Press on the Hamas social organizations in Gaza. She knows her field. And she wrote after the attack, actually she wrote it just about a few weeks ago, I'm quoting her, "In the near 3 decades that I have been involved with Gaza and her people, I have never seen the kind of physical and psychological destruction that I see there today. The wounds of this war could prove too severe to heal." Some of the things that happened came as pleasant surprises to the Israelis. Others were less pleasant. On the happy side, the United States continued to give throughout the Israeli massacre in Gaza, continued to give it blanket support, even as human rights organizations were issuing reports by July 22nd. Human rights organizations were issuing reports stating Israel is targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. The United States, first President Obama, and then his representatives in the State Department and elsewhere, they kept reiterating, it became a sort of mantra, that Israel has the right to defend itself. It was clear, and it ought not to be forgotten, that Mr. Obama became the enabler-in-chief of this massacre in Gaza. The reason is not too hard to find. Immediately as the operation began, Congress gave Israel wall-to-wall support in the Senate, in the House, and it would have required some spine to resist the congressional juggernaut orchestrated by the Israel lobby. And I think there is consensus that one part of the anatomy that's missing with Mr. Obama is spine, and so, or has gone missing. His spine has been able for the past 6 years. And so he didn't attempt to resist the juggernaut. And even if you want to grant the amount of pressure that was being exerted on him, it certainly did not require him, day in and day out, in the face of the atrocities, it certainly did not require him to keep saying Israel has the right of self-defense. Internationally, it was also a happy picture for Israel. Egypt, under the mass murderer Sisi, and Saudi Arabia, which has a severe deficit in the IQ department. Egypt and Saudi Arabia both gave Israel full support, hoping to see Hamas defeated. The Arab League also gave Israel support. It only met once during the attack, and it met to endorse the rigged ceasefire agreement. Throughout the Arab world in general, there was little attention paid to the Israeli assault for reasons which won't come as a surprise to anyone. The people in, as was listed, the people in Yemen, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, they have problems of their own right now, and it would have been almost expecting something superhuman of them to come now to the rescue or to the support of the hapless people of Gaza. The only surprising aberration internationally, and to their eternal credit, were the Latin American countries. Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, El Salvador, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela, they all rose heroically in support of the people of Gaza, and it was a completely unself-interested support. It was really, I think, a redemption of that part of the world, but for all intents and purposes, I hate that cliche. I would like to strike it from the record. The bottom line is Gaza was alone and abandoned during this latest Israeli assault. There were some unpleasant surprises for Mr. Netanyahu. The best known ones, of course, those terror tunnels. The Hamas had managed to create a quite sophisticated, ramified catacomb system, tunnel system in Gaza. As some of you might know, 9 out of every 8 Arabs major in civil engineering. And so when you put a lot of unemployed civil engineers together, you get that Hamas tunnel system. And it caused Israel an unprecedented number of combatant casualties, About 66 Israeli soldiers were killed, as I said, in cast lead in 2008-9. It was about 10, and half of those 10, nearly half, were friendly fire in 2008-9. So that was a surprise for Israel. And as a result, because of those tunnels, there never actually was a ground invasion of Gaza. The Israeli troops stayed pretty much on the border. They never got more than 1 or 2 miles inside Gaza. The Israeli claim quickly became that we have to destroy these terror tunnels, which are threatening to wreak havoc to our civilian population. But that was all complete nonsense, easily demonstrated. Israel acknowledges that it destroyed about 32 tunnels. Of those 32, only 12 were actually cross-border tunnels, that is, going from Gaza inside Israel. Well, if Israel really wanted to destroy those terror tunnels, which it says were threatening its civilian population because they were crossing the border, there was something very simple they can do. It actually did not require a degree in civil engineering to figure out. All you have to do is do what Sisi is now doing in Egypt. So the president, so-called president of Egypt, he says, we have a problem with terror tunnels. And he says it's because of those terror tunnels that 30 members of the Egyptian army were recently killed in the Sinai. So he's making the same claim as Israel. But did Mr. Sisi, in his efforts to eliminate those terror tunnels, has he gone into Gaza? Did he have to target hospitals, ambulances, schools, businesses, in order to eliminate the tunnels? I, for one, am not pleased with what he's doing now. He's building a moat on the Egyptian side of the Gaza border in the Sinai. He's causing mass displacement. About 990 families are affected, which means 990 homes, excuse me, which comes to about 10 to 15,000 civilians will be affected, and I happen to think that's an atrocity. However, he's doing it on his side of the border. If there really were a problem with these terror tunnels, Israel certainly doesn't lack in earth-moving equipment. You could just have taken a bulldozer and build on your side of the border a wall or a moat. But the fact of the matter is, it never had to do with the so-called terror tunnels entering Israel. The problem was the tunnels inside Gaza. They turned out to be an effective means of fighting an invading army. And so the soldiers come in. The tunnels were impervious to, or not penetrable by, artillery shells or aerial bombing. So when the Israelis come in, the Hamas militants kept popping out of the tunnels. And that's what accounted for the comparatively high combatant casualty rate. And so what Israel wanted to do was destroy all the tunnels inside Gaza, not the tunnels going from Gaza to Israel. And they wanted to destroy them on the principle that the people of Gaza have no right to defend themselves. That whenever Israel wants to, in one of its favorite locutions, whenever Israel wants to mow the lawn in Gaza, then the people of Gaza have to simply lie down and allow themselves to be mowed. They're not allowed to resist. So the right to destroy the tunnels actually translate into the right to deny the people of Gaza any right of self-defense. However, even if it were true even if it were true that the tunnels passing the border from Gaza to Israel were Israel's real aim, let's for argument's sake allow it was their real aim. Why weren't they allowed to build those tunnels? Israel is allowed at its whim and will to send airplanes into Gaza, to bomb Gaza, to fire artillery shells into Gaza, to send ground troops into Gaza, to send tanks into Gaza, but the people of Gaza, they're not allowed to invade the sacred space of Israel. Only this border going in one direction under the laws of war can be porous. On the other direction, the border has to be sealed. That's called the laws of war. The other claim that Israel made was about these Hamas rockets. I'm not sure about the people in this room, but for me, a rocket conjures a fairly sophisticated and large weapon. So what happened with these Hamas rockets? According to Israel, 4,000 Hamas rockets were fired into Israel from Gaza. I'm leaving aside for a moment the mortar shells, just the rockets. The 4,000 rockets, they resulted in 7 civilian casualties and $15 million in damage, property damage. Well, there's obviously a huge discrepancy here that needs to be accounted for. 4,000 rockets, but 7 civilian casualties and $15 million in property damage. If this room were destroyed, it would probably be $15 million in property damage. That's what $15 million is nowadays. So how could 4,000 rockets cause only $15 million in property damage? Well, as all you know, it was all because of that product of Jewish genius, Iron Dome, the anti-missile defense system of Israel. That's what we're told. But it's completely implausible on a moment's reflection, the claims that are made for Iron Dome. People say, were it not for Iron Dome, there would have been hundreds, thousands of Israeli casualties. So let's do what practical people do. You make comparisons. In 2008 to 9, there was no Iron Dome during Operation Cast Lead. According to Israel, Hamas fired 1,000 rockets at Israel. There were 3 civilian deaths before Iron Dome. 1,000 rockets, 3 civilian deaths, and curiously, again, $15 million in property damage. So let's do the math. 1,000 rockets caused 3 civilian deaths. So 4,000 rockets would cause, for those of you who remember your ratios from 4th grade, how many civilian deaths should 4,000 rockets have caused? I heard it. This must be civil engineer from Iraq. Yes, the correct answer is 12. Well, there were in fact 7 civilian deaths. So Iron Dome at most accounted for saving 5 lives. 1,000 rockets, 3 civilian deaths. 4,000 rockets, 12 civilian deaths. 5. But it didn't even account for that, because Israel had significantly improved its civil defense system after 2008-9. So whatever lives were saved, in this case 5, they were accounted for not by Iron Dome, but by an improved civil defense system. Without going into the details, though I'm happy to do so if anybody would like to enter into that terrain, in fact, Hamas had no rockets in its armory. It had no allies from whom to acquire them. It had no way to smuggle them in, and it didn't have the wherewithal to manufacture them. The Iron Dome was just a fiction. One of the world's leading anti-missile defense experts, Theodore Postel, of MIT, he said at most, Iron Dome successfully deflected or disabled 10% of the rockets. At most, 10%. So now do the math. 4,000 rockets, 10% were deflected by Iron Dome. That leaves 3,600 rockets. 3,600 rockets. So how do you have so little civilian damage? Postel's explanation, which in my opinion is close to correct, he says that it's because of Israel's sophisticated civil defense system. But that still wouldn't account for the fact that, as we know, hospitals do not go into shelters. Schools do not go into shelters. Businesses don't go into shelters. How do you account for the fact that there was only $15 million in property damage? The shelter system can explain why seven civilians were killed despite 3,600 rockets, but that can't explain the property damage. This is all a slightly long-winded way of saying there were no rockets. There were enhanced fireworks that Hamas was firing, and each side, both Israel and Hamas, had an interest in inflating the nature of the weapon that was being used. How did things end? The ending was actually quite interesting and revealing. Israel descended into it was a descent into barbarism by the end. They attacked 1 UN civilian shelter, 2 UN civilian shelters, 3 UN civilian shelters, 4 UN civilian shelters, children, women, that's who in the shelters. And now the pressure begins to build inside the United Nations. These are UN shelters. Ban Ki-moon, you comatose puppet of the United States, why aren't you saying anything? They attacked the 5th, a 6th, and then on August 3rd, they attacked that 7th UN shelter. And finally, Ban Ki-moon, he was forced to say something. He called it a moral outrage and a criminal act. So now the puppet was actually acting in defiance of the puppeteer in Washington, Obama, oh great man of change. Obama, he was now isolated on the international stage, and so the State Department finally had to issue a statement also on August 3rd. The shelter was attacked on August 3rd. Ban Ki-moon makes a statement on August 3rd, and then the US State Department says, we are appalled by this disgraceful act. And now Israel knew the game was over. The US had finally spoken, and on the same day, August 3rd, Netanyahu announced that the ground invasion was over. As it happened, the conflict itself hadn't ended, because now a new event occurred, which was the emergence out of nowhere of ISIS, the beheading of the American reporter. The cameras shifted again to Iraq, and Israel was now able to carry on a free-for-all. By the end, it was almost surreal, because you just were watching on the screen as Israel was targeting high-rise apartment buildings, and they were just collapsing. There was no pretense even that these were military objects. It looked, by the end, both sides, I think, were caught in a stalemate. And even though Israel was, as I said, carrying on as if it were a free-for-all, Hamas, not any longer the so-called rockets, but their mortar shells, were still inflicting casualties on Israeli civilians. In the last hour, they killed 2 Israeli civilians, the mortar shells, and so it came to a halt. The balance sheet of this latest attack, I think neither side came out victorious. Mr. Netanyahu called it a great military and political achievement. You know, it's the equivalent of the Battle of Borodino in the 1812 war, or Iwo Jima, such a great military and political achievement. Sort of the military achievement you see on a subway in New York when kids are playing with their computer games. But notwithstanding his self-boasting, he did not manage to break up the unity government. He did not manage to get Hamas designated a terrorist organization. In fact, all that happened was Israel got even further identified as a terrorist state. He wanted to thwart EU-US negotiations with Hamas. In the end, Israel itself was negotiating with Hamas. He was not able to disable the rockets, as they were called, or detonate the terror tunnels. His main achievement was he was able to satiate the bloodlust of Israeli society, a bloodlust which in no small part he himself had whipped up. On the other side of the balance sheet, Hamas set as its major goal to end the blockade of Gaza. It did not achieve that goal. The blockade continues as we speak now, and I see no reason to be optimistic that it's going to be lifted, for the simple reason that not only Israel doesn't want to lift the blockade, but the so-called Palestinian Authority also doesn't want to lift the blockade, because nobody wants to give Hamas a political victory. And so it will probably stay in place. Well, that leaves me with the second half of my remarks, but I have to check with the timer. Where do we stand for time? Okay, so I don't want to just be sort of a bearer of grim news. We have to talk practical things. What can be done? What needs to be done to finally bring an end to the madness, to the sheer lunacy, but a lunacy which has a method behind it, but it's still lunatic. What needs to be done? I think the first point to make is one has to make a distinction between a right and a strategy or a tactic. Under international law, Palestinians have the right to armed resistance against a foreign occupation. That's a right under international law. And I see no point why we should now be making an exception for the Palestinians. There are many other places in the world where people engaged in armed resistance against foreign occupations. I lived through many of them. People will remember the armed resistances to the Portuguese occupation of Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique. armed resistance of the South African apartheid regime when it was occupying Namibia, and the international community in many resolutions in the United Nations certified the right of people living under a foreign occupation to use armed resistance. So that right redounds as well on the Palestinians. But the fact that you have a right does not mean it's the wisest, the shrewdest, the most prudent strategy. Strategy is pretty simple in terms of its criteria. The criteria or criterion is it's got to work. If it's not effective, then you don't continue it, even if you have the right to pursue it. This criterion is simple. It's effectivity, what works, with obviously one major qualification, and the qualification is there are certain tactics or certain strategies which are just so appalling that they have to be rejected, even though they might work. The ISIS beheadings as a strategy and a tactic, in fact, they work. They sow fear and dread in the hearts of their enemies. But even if it works, it should be, I think, unacceptable. And so, bearing that in mind, let's see what the Palestinians have attempted, what works, what doesn't work. The strategy that they have invested most in the past 20 years is this thing called diplomacy. Its most recent phase began with the Oslo Accord in 1993, and the premise was, instead of resistance, instead of popular resistance, we're going to negotiate. And we'll negotiate under the aegis of the plantation owner, namely the United States. The belief was, if Israel could see that Palestinians posed no security threat, they would end the occupation. If Israel refused, then the US, seeing Palestinian good faith, Israeli bad faith, the US would exert pressure and force Israel to end the occupation. Well, those premises were manifestly mistaken at the time, and nobody seriously, 20 years later, believes they have any credibility. The historical record shows Israel never withdraws unless it's forced to. And the US, for domestic political reasons, will not put sufficient pressure on Israel to withdraw. So, the international diplomacy strategy, and I would include in that strategy the attempts to send the case to the International Criminal Court, are a dead end. Hamas, its strategy has been armed resistance on the premise that Israel only understands the language of force. That strategy has now been tested in the last 5 years 3 times. Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, and now Operation Protective Edge. It doesn't work. It's not to carry a judgment on the right of Palestinians to engage in armed resistance. They have that right, but politically, it's a failure. It doesn't work. It's not to blame Hamas for the death and destruction. I, for one, don't blame them at all. I hold Israel and the US wholly responsible, but the armed resistance has not proven to be an effective tactic. The third tactic they tried, now it's about 25 to 30 years ago, the one that was mentioned by Professor Renee, the last name? Warringer. The third tactic was the one she passed through, and I did as well, living off and on in the occupied territories during those years, was the first Intifada. And that was based on mass nonviolent resistance. It was quite an impressive display of nonviolent mass resistance. And the premise was, we're going to make this occupation ungovernable for Israel. They established all sorts of alternative popular institutions, boycotts, general strikes, and so forth. And they thought, if we stay nonviolent in the face of the massive Israeli repression, and it was quite horrible back then, the house demolitions, the administrative detentions, the mass systematic, methodical use of torture. The estimates, I think, by Human Rights Watch were between 1987 and 1993, Israel had tortured between 20 and 30,000 Palestinian detainees. It was a very ugly period. But the expectation or the hope was, if we stay nonviolent in the face of this massive repression, eventually the international community will put enough pressure on Israel to desist. In fact, it was a remarkably successful, even though short-lived, rebellion against Israeli occupation. The Israelis actually were forced to modify their modus operandi of maintaining the occupation. The big problem for Israel was twofold. Remember, Israel is a very small society, 7.5 million people, of whom 6 million are Jewish. It's a small society, and the Palestinian occupation, when you have mass civil resistance, it's a real challenge. I remember my closest friend, Musa Abu Heshhesh, from Al Khalil, Hebron. He had a 2-year-old son, Orwa, who's now a surgeon. When the Israeli jeep passed by, he picked up a little stone, and threw it at the jeep, and shouted, "Jesh," the army. And literally everyone from 2 to grandmothers up to age 70, they were on the firing line. It was a people awakened. And that meant that in order to govern the occupied territories, all of Israeli society, excuse me, all of Israeli society had to be mobilized, which meant, if you were there during those years, you would see in army fatigues, you would see 65, 68-year-old men from Israel, because they had to mobilize their whole civilian population, their reserves. And the Israelis began to worry. If all of our soldiers are engaged in chasing little children down alleyways, throwing stones, then they're not training to fight a real war. And that was a problem for Israel. It needs that army for what it calls real wars. So it had to figure out a way how to get the army out of the occupied territories, but maintain the occupation. And the second thing, the second big problem back then was public relations. I was a teacher, I was a professor back then in a quite conservative school. Its 3 most famous alumni were Alan Dershowitz, Meyer Kahane, the founder of the Jewish Defense League, and Baruch Goldstein, who had presided over the Hebron massacre in 1994, or 1992, I can't remember, it was 92 or 94, I'm not sure. And I remember in class, one day the subject of the Intifada came up, and one student who was neither Jewish nor Arab, just as we call it, a white ethnic, an Italian student, he said in class, "Stone, Uzi, that's not fair." And that was Israel's public relations dilemma. You can't really justify shooting kids down dead when they're throwing a stone. And so Israel wanted to figure out how to remove from themselves the onus of violating grossly the human rights of Palestinians. And the way they resolved the two problems was they created, in 1993, a Palestinian Authority to do all the dirty work for them. Still, it was a significant success, even though short-lived, and not having produced the results that were hoped for, namely an end to the occupation. So looking at that record, what do we conclude from it? Politics, among other things, is you capitalize on your strengths and you target your enemy's weaknesses. What are the Palestinian strengths? First of all, the will. The people's will has been quite impressive, in particular in Gaza, though now spirits have been significantly undermined both in the West Bank and Gaza, but presumably somewhere it's now somewhat buried, that will still lives. The second big strength of the Palestinians is borne witness by the crowd here today, which has been my experience, and I was actually quite surprised. I spoke in Halifax, which is not a booming metropolis. I spoke in Halifax. By the way, I don't like booming metropolises. I'm with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The more primitive, the better I like it, I think. Civilization is not worth it. In any event, Halifax is not a booming metropolis. Nonetheless, much to my surprise, because as I think Sarah said, the news cycle is such that Gaza has now disappeared from the news. And I expected when I went to Halifax, there'd be 20 people, which is fine. And there were 400, and 100 had to be turned away. And it was the same thing in Concordia, and I suspect for your school, the pronunciation of which still eludes me, Guelph? Is it go and wolf? Guelph? Guelph. And here, the crowd is quite large, I think. The fact of the matter is, for, I suppose, complex historical reasons, there's simply no other cause in the West which inspires as much passion and commitment as the cause of Palestine. Not Iraq, not Syria, not Afghanistan, not climate change or nuclear proliferation, not the Kurds, Kashmir, or Tibet inspire remotely the amount of passion and commitment as Palestine. If there were a panel today, this evening, with a representative from the Kurds, Kashmir, and Tibet, my guess is no more than 30 people would show up. If there were a meeting today on the various horrors unfolding now in the Middle East, a panel on Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Afghanistan, maybe 40 people would show up. But Palestine has that peculiar resonance, moral resonance, and that, I think, is the second biggest asset never exploited properly, capitalized on, but the second biggest asset of the Palestinians. Israel's biggest weaknesses are its flagrant violations of international law. Public opinion now broadly opposes the settlements, the occupation, the blockade, the denial of Palestinian self-determination. Nearly the whole of humanity, with the exception of your prime minister, recognizes these. It's only a technically an exception if you honor him with being a member of humanity, then the only exception would be your prime minister recognizes the settlements, the occupation, the blockade, and denial of Palestinian self-determination as being flagrant violations of international law. And that became clear during the British House of Commons debate, the UK being the US's most loyal ally. But when you watch the debate, as I did, it was well worth listening to. It lasted 5 hours. One House of Commons member after another came up, denounced the settlements, denounced the assault on Gaza, and denounced Israel's refusal to recognize the Palestinian right to self-determination. So that's Israel's weaknesses, its flagrant violation of international law. Palestinian strengths are the will and the solidarity movement. So what's a realistic scenario for combining the strengths of the Palestinians with the weaknesses of the Israelis? I think that we have to take advantage of those strengths, and if we target the Israeli weaknesses, I think there's a good possibility you can force Israel to withdraw. Concretely, that means the International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinion in July 2004, it stated that the wall that Israel has been building in the occupied West Bank is illegal under international law, that the wall has to be dismantled, and that if Israel doesn't dismantle the wall, the international community has to see that it's done. All the major human rights organizations have also declared that the Israeli siege of Gaza is illegal under international law. So, if 2 million West Bank Palestinians marched non-violently on the Israeli wall, holding in one hand the advisory opinion of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, in the other hand, a pick, a hammer, in the spirit of Pete Seeger, if I had a hammer, and under the banner, "Stop stealing our country," because the wall is just a fancy name for theft. Stop stealing our country, tear down the illegal wall. Or if 1.5 million Gazans marched on the Israeli border with the 1 million Gazan children at the head of the demonstration. That's how civil rights came to our country, meaning the United States. People forget. In the United States, it was in 1965 when the children of Selma, Alabama, the children, they were put on the front lines as the Southern whites used the high-velocity hoses and attack dogs, the German Shepherds. It was that confrontation that forced the crisis in the conscience of Americans and the passage eventually of the Voting Rights Act. If 1.5 million Gazans marched on the wall with the 1 million Gazan children at the head of the demonstration under the banner, "Stop starving us, end the illegal siege," well, I'm not naive. I'm perfectly aware that if that was done, Israel would kill a large number of the protesters. So I'm going to preempt that criticism. Those of you who are thinking, who is he kidding? Israel will mow them down, or as Israel likes to put it, we'll mow the lawn. But that's where we kick in. If the solidarity movement, if 500,000 of Palestine supporters around the world, which I think is perfectly realistic. Remember, just in London alone, during the last attack on Gaza, 150,000 people amassed to protest. if a 500,000 supporters of Palestinian rights were to march and close down the United Nations in New York, march and close down the UN in Geneva, if the whole world's attention was focused on what Israel is doing, the same pressure would build on the comatose puppet, not necessarily Ban Ki-moon, whoever replaces him, because they all fulfill the same role, would be forced to do something and to say something. I think on a much larger scale, it's possible to replicate what happened on August 3rd, when the pressure became so intense, both the UN and then the US was forced to act, forced to say something, forced to do something. If the Palestinians find the inner strength, find the will, find the capacity for self-sacrifice, because yes, I'm aware many of them, and I don't say it happily, many of them will be killed. However, in my opinion, long before Israel killed 2,200 Palestinians, 500 plus children, which is what happened during Operation Protective Edge, long before we reach those figures, if Palestinians find the strength to remain nonviolent, and crucially, critically, if we in the West do our job, then I think Israel would be forced to withdraw. International diplomacy has failed, armed resistance has failed, but I think mass nonviolent resistance, synchronized with the solidarity movement abroad, I think it has a reasonable chance of success. Thank you.